What is up, everybody? Welcome to the Halftime Snacks podcast. This show features short interviews that you can listen during the halftime of your favorite sports events. Every Tuesday, I host fun conversations with talented people in the sports industry where we'll learn from their stories, knowledge, and experiences. So go grab your favorite snack and come snack with us. Are you ready? Let's go! Joining us now is a Harvard alumni who has over 10 years of experience writing for the NFL, Boston Globe, Washington Post, and Sports Illustrated. Today, he's a sports business reporter at Sportico. Sportico is a digital content and media company that brings high quality data, information, news, and strategy from what's hot and relevant in the sports business. Besides being an expert in sports tech, media, and everything else, he has wide experiences as a content creator, but he's also a teacher at Brandeis University in sports journalism, which is an exciting new topic. So, buckle up for today's episode, ladies and gentlemen. Allow me to introduce Jacob Feldman. Jacob, welcome to the Halftime Snacks, mate. How are you?
Good, good. Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here, and thank you so much for that kind introduction. I'm excited to chat it up.
Yeah, as I was saying right before our call, I've been following you for a while on Twitter. I think that you're one of the most underfollowed accounts out there. We got to make something about that because
Let's change that. Sure.
you post so much good content out there from the world of sports and sports business. We're gonna talk about all that. But right before that, we always kick it off here on the halftime snacks with an icebreaker. And the one I
hmm
have for you is the following: would you rather be the owner of an average MLS team? I don't follow the MLS, so I don't know what an average MLS team, but maybe you do, or maybe you don't.
Okay.
Okay, but would you rather be the owner of an average MLS team or have the experience of winning one Super Bowl as starting quarterback? What would you rather?
Ooh. Definitely winning one Super Bowl as starting quarterback. No doubt about that. I mean, there's only been probably 40 maximum, maybe even less, people in the history of the world who can say they've won a Super Bowl as a starting quarterback, and so I'll happily join that bunch.
Yeah, that's a great point. That when I was doing my research and I was reading a lot about you and your story and your experiences, I was actually quite impressed because you've been writing for over 10 years since
hmm
even before you graduated high school. So you've been in
hmm
the media and content business for a while. So how do you remember content back then? Was it so much more different? Was like websites different at the time, or like media online was so much more different? Like how exactly do you remember it? If someone asks you like how was it back then, what would you say? What's a good answer?
Yeah, it's a great question. Like you said, I've been doing this not that long in the grand scheme of things compared to some other people that I work with and that I follow. But do feel like I've come along in a decade that has seen a tremendous amount of change in the way this job is done. When I started out, like you said, 10 years ago in high school, I really started in middle school. I used to, I created this thing called the neighborhood newsletter. It was, 4 pages front and back, printed out on my inkjet printer, and I sold door to door for $1. That was to me like what media was that was like 2008, 2009. And even as I was getting started in high school, even early in college, I thought my path was going to be, okay, let's start at a small paper. I was looking at jobs, in the Dakotas, in Kansas, small towns covering high school, maybe minor league baseball, that kind of thing, and then slowly work your way up. That was kind of the way it was done. Maybe you cover a team for a while, and then ideally you get a national job at some place like the Washington Post or Sports Illustrated. And the internet just totally disrupted all of that, disrupted the path, because now you don't need to kind of walk all those steps of the ladder. You can. I think it's much more important to define yourself in a certain niche and have an expertise that maybe other people don't have or don't want to have or don't care about, because there are enough people, I think, out there that will care about whatever you care about. And then you can find a home online. There aren't, when I was at Sports Illustrated, even early on when I was there, we had pretty strict word counts on a story because it had to fit on a certain, line, certain half of a magazine page, basically. When I was young, I was right. They gave me, 800 words that was going to run kind of in a box inside of another story. And so you're still very tied to that print ecosystem. You're tied to the print timeline of, okay, we need the story by Thursday so we can do edits, get them back by Monday, edit it, get it to the publisher, the printer, all that. And that's totally, for the most part, gone. And if it's not gone, it's the cart has been put fully in front of the horse, in the sense that, now you write for web, and then they kind of choose what goes in the magazine. And at Sportico, we don't have, yet at least, we don't have any print publication. We're all online, and so I feel like I've really seen that evolution over the last 10 years, and everything that's come with it, good and bad.
Yeah, because I do think that those 10 exact years were just the transformation of like how newspapers went online. And it's
Hmm.
funny because the other day I was just having that conversation with one of my grandpa's friend, and he was saying like I don't understand like how fast things went online, and it was just a matter of a couple of years. But I'm super curious, particularly because I'm also a writer. I've been writing for 2 years only,
Hmm.
and I know like kind of like what it means to be right behind a blank page, or a white Word document, and be trying to create and come up with something new. So I don't want to ask you a lot on your writing process, but before that,
Sure.
maybe just as a opener for or an icebreaker for that, what has been
Hmm.
the best piece you've ever worked on, and why?
Ooh. That's a good question. I think I can tell you the ones I'm proud of, I guess. I got to write a couple cover stories at Sports Illustrated. Those were a ton of fun. Those are hanging in my parents' house, in a frame now, which is awesome, and something I, never really thought I'd be able to get to do, and was really lucky to get to do. So those are special to me. I got to write a story about a female boxer named Christy Salters, who was on the cover of Sports Illustrated in the '90s. Was the first woman boxer on the cover of Sports Illustrated, and had a really harrowing period after that. She um, came out of the closet, but was in a committed relationship with an abusive husband, and the husband ultimately tried to kill her when she left, and when she tried to be more honest about who she was. And very traumatic episode, and she fought back from that, and eventually did make it back into the ring for one or two more fights, before moving on with her life, and that was kind of the end of her career. And so that was, I was that was one of the first stories I wrote at Sports Illustrated, really. And it's to kind of have to tell, or get to tell, such a dramatic story like that was a lot of pressure, a lot of responsibility, but I was pretty satisfied with the job I did there. So that story is one that sticks out to me. Like, oh, I can actually, maybe do this, and maybe hang with the best of them, so to speak.
No, and what's also cool about your experience is that you've got to work and write for so many different brands that have different like perspectives on like
Hmm.
sports, right? Like, of course, the NFL is very, very direct, but Sportico is more like the business side,
Hmm.
and Sport Illustrated maybe tries to give it a different spin.
Sure.
But the one thing that I'm curious about right now is to ask you, like, how much of your time do you spend creating while you're creating the piece? How much of your time, if you would think in like percentage terms, how much
Hmm.
of your time would you devote to reading and researching versus
Hmm.
actually writing the piece?
It's a good question. It depends a lot on the story, but for the most part, for most stories, especially now at Sportico, it's probably 90-10 research writing. I try to do all the research and then sit down in an hour, and knock out the story. That's, generally how I work. I like to have everything, kind of pretty down pat before I start writing. I There have been cases where you do write a story, then you have to go back, and you get more information, and that just kind of feels more stressful to me. Of kind of like, okay, did I update everything in here, and all that? So I like to have everything down, write the story. But of course, when you're working on a longer story, a feature, or a profile, those are going to obviously entail more writing time. Those might be more like, even then, it's still 70-30. It's much heavier on the research and the reporting, because that just makes your life easier as a writer. Yeah.
Yeah, and do you go like from 0 to 100, or you like start making notes and then like you put them together?
Mm.
Like how exactly do you come up with like the whole process? Is it are you someone that goes from 0 to 1 and that's it, or you go from like a draft and then slowly edit away? Like, what's your process?
Yeah, I usually like to know my lead before I sit down and write, so that I'm constantly in my head, while I'm eating breakfast. I'm thinking, okay, how am I going to start this story? What's my first sentence going to be? 'Cause that's always the hardest part, as you know. And then from there, hopefully, it kind of flows, and you're just kind of telling a story, and you're thinking, okay, if I'm sitting down with you, over a beer, and explaining this, how would I do it? And that's, try to sit down and do that, get to the end, and then go back and say, okay, can I clean this up? Does it make more sense to move stuff around? So I'd like to do that. At times I will kind of do a very rough outline, so to speak, of just kind of a word, keyword. I want to hit this, then maybe I'll get to this person, and then, I kind of, just to kind of make sure that my fingers can keep up with my thoughts, because oftentimes after you write that first sentence, you're like, okay, I have the rest of the story. Let's go, go, go. And then you're like, oh, what was I going to do next? But so I try to maybe at that point do a very quick outline just so I can keep up with myself. But in general, yeah, 0 to 100, and then go back and clean it up as much as I can.
Yeah, that's a very interesting point, and I do think maybe for sure you realize this at some point, but this is something of my realizations when I started writing is how much it really structures your thoughts to write, to really put them
Sure.
on paper, and it's funny because I'm not sure where I read this or who I heard this say, but they basically say that you think you know so much more until you actually write about it,
Yes.
then you realize
Hmm.
how little you actually knew about it. Like, wow, you had no idea what we were talking about. So, it's
Hmm.
funny. It's funny how that like process happens, and it's one of my realizations. What was there? Was there any other kind of like realizations for you? Something that you realized along the way of like becoming this like professional writer and someone that devoted himself to the career of really writing and creating content? Was there something else that you kind of like noticed or learned along the way of just creating more and more content?
Yeah, I think one of the biggest things for me was just learning to be okay with stories not being perfect. That was hard at first. Of like, let me make sure I know everything here that there is to know about this topic. But yeah, I think you learn quickly as a reporter that one day I'm writing about uh, streaming media, and the next day I'm writing about NFTs, and the next day I'm writing about a stadium being built, and it's just going to be impossible for me to know as much as the people I'm talking to. And so I think you have to learn to recognize what you don't know, like you're saying, and accept that you're going to enter into a lot of these interviews, being stupid, basically, like pretending you know as little as possible, because that's going to ultimately elicit the simplest answers, the cleanest quotes. And so you have to look okay, feel
Yeah.
okay looking dumb every now and again to kind of get to
Yeah.
that point where you are confident enough to eventually write the story.
Yeah, it feels like what you mean is just to be comfortable with being uncomfortable, at any stage of like the writing process, just be comfortable with that. How long did it took you to find your style, or what some
Hmm.
people call their voice in the writing? How long did it took you, or you think you're still trying to figure that out?
Yeah, I definitely think I'm still trying to figure it out to some degree. I think being at Sports Illustrated would really help. And maybe it was um, about 3 years in there or so. I spent a little over 4 years there total. For a while, I was writing a daily NFL newsletter, which so you're up at 11 p.m. On a Sunday night. A bunch of games have happened. You need to write this newsletter so you can go to sleep. And so I think like the time pressure of that really kind of helped me slow, and the regularity of doing that every day. Um, I passed it on to Connor Orr, who's still at Sports Illustrated, and he used to give me a lot of grief for creating that and then dumping it on him, because it is a pain at times. But I do think, just like you said, writing regularly, writing a lot, you're gonna eventually get to the point where you are comfortable, where it does become easier, and that's the only way to do that, really.
Yeah, and something that's funny, something that we were actually speaking about this before the episode, is that you particularly, you have a degree in history. You went to
Hmm.
college to study history, and then you're currently writing for sports. Was this the path that you always wanted to take? Was this like sports was always like something that you wanted to write about always, or was this something that you started to find like a passion just because you were a fan and you were like, oh, so I like to watch the NFL, so I might as well just write about it. Like, how exactly did that intersection or transition from history to sports happen?
Yeah, I always knew I wanted to write, to be a writer, to be a journalist of some kind. I got to the college paper, and I knew about sports as a fan of sports, so I got put on sports, and that I got internships in sports and haven't looked back. And I'm glad. I obviously love this space, this world. I love thinking about these things. I love having these types of conversations. So I do think it's a good fit. Obviously, I do wonder, what it would be like to cover some other things every now and again. Um, but I think ultimately, and people who talk to sports journalists recognize this. Like, the job's not that different. I'm more of a business reporter than I'm a sports reporter at the end of the day. Like, what you cover within sports, the skills are very transferable. it's just kind of the names and the topics that are a little different, but the skills of journalism, the skills of writing, are pretty similar across them. So yeah, it's a lot of fun to work in sports, but it's not that different from if you're thinking about it, I would make sure that you're passionate about journalism and writing more so than sports. If you care a lot about sports, there's other great jobs in this industry, I think.
Yeah, that's an interesting point that you say there, and I think I also felt that throughout my time creating content is that sometimes I found myself not even speaking about the sport, itself.
Hmm.
I wasn't even covering, what plays went through on a game or what was the result or the end, who was the champion. I wasn't even talking about that. So it's funny how you mentioned that as well, and it's also funny how you bring up that like. That point there at the end, because that was actually the next thing that I wanted to ask you, like
Hmm.
how exactly do you differentiate a sports journalist with someone who's just journaling for the New York Times, just writing about politics
Hmm.
or about business or about technology? Like what exactly makes up a sports journalist in your opinion?
I'm not sure I have a great definition for that. I mean, obviously, anybody I think whose focus is in the world of sports and is writing, fits that bill. But it goes back to what we were talking about earlier. There used to be a very defined section, a sports section. You were hired to be a sports writer and you would cover a team or cover a league. And now it's much less defined. I look at, Chelsea Janes, who I worked with at the Washington Post, was covering baseball when I was there, went on to cover the 2016 election. Isabel, who was covering hockey at the time, went on to be a foreign correspondent in Russia. Um, I know plenty of people who were in sports and moved out and maybe came back in. Um, and so it is a porous line. And yeah, when you move on to like Sportico and sports business, all of a sudden, my peers are people who are covering media or are covering tech, and they touch on sports, whereas I'm covering sports and I touch on media and I touch on tech, and so we all end up at the same place. And yeah, the lines between what your really topic of coverage are can vary day to day.
Would you say that because sports is a topic of popular interest,
Hmm.
there's more particular competition? Like people want to be like in sports, they want to cover the NFL, like they want to talk about like what happened. Or do you think that there's not really that, like once you're like really inside, there's not so much like competition within itself?
Uh, there's a lot of competition for sure. I talked to plenty of. You mentioned, I've taught sports journalism at Brandeis. I've had the pleasure of kind of talking to a lot of reporters who are a little younger than me, and it is a hard field to break into, especially as we were talking about. The standard path isn't there the way it was of kind of working for your hometown paper and working up. That's harder than ever. So there is a lot of competition. The flip side of that is that there's a lot of people interested to read it. We always talked about at Sports Illustrated, you get to write these. I'm talking about writing a story about a woman who, kind of decides to come out and live, her life at ultimately the risk of her life. And that's, it's a sports story in a sense, but it's really more a human story. But because it's sports, people are read it. You have a chance to write it. You get a chance just to do all sorts of things when you're covering sports, because people are going to be interested in any story that has, the Yankees or Michael Jordan or whatever big name attached to it.
Yeah, and considering that, how would you advise someone who's maybe starting up now, who's wrapping up high school or even mid school, and is thinking
Hmm.
about it and is listening to this episode and he's saying, "Wow, I want to be like Jacob." What would
Hmm.
you advise? What would you say? Like considering, of course, how things have changed and how it's not really how you did it. How would you do it if you would need to start over all over again, but today?
Yeah, yeah, I think plenty about that. I think that the two key things, the first is developing, like you've done, like multimedia skills. I think just writing is gonna, if all you want to do is write words on a screen, that's gonna make it harder for you to get a job. So if I was 12 or 13 or 14 or 15 or 16, I would be learning how to edit TikTok videos and YouTube videos and learning how to publish podcasts, and keeping track of whatever the next thing is, because that helped me too. Like I worked on the newsletter for a college paper, and so that's how I ended up kind of finding the spot writing this daily NFL newsletter for Sports Illustrated, and it's because I had some vague familiarity with newsletters and the tools in that world. And that when you're coming up, those are the skills you're going to have that the people 20 years older than you don't have. They might have better sources, they might be better writers, they might be better at all sorts of things. But if you can have some of these newer skills, that makes you more valuable. That's one. And then two is thinking about really defining your small. It can be very small, area of coverage, whether it's a certain sport, whether it's a certain type of sports business, whether it's clothing in sports, or meteorology in sports, or medicine in sports. Like, trying to define as narrowly as possible something that you are really passionate about, that you feel like you can go deeper on than anybody else and
Mhm.
not get bored. I think if you can find that and then pair that with the skills that I was talking about, that makes you a very, highly qualified, and set you up for success early on.
Yeah, and I think just going back to your first point, and I do think that that's really valuable. Is to if you think about it, the new generations are the ones starting to use TikTok, for instance, right? So
Hmm.
so for instance, I'm a millennial, maybe you're as well, and
Sure, same.
I don't
Yeah.
know I don't know if you started using TikTok, but right at the beginning when it came out, like I wasn't even interested. I was like, there's
Right.
nothing in that app for me. But interestingly enough, for Gen Z, the young people, they were the young folks were really interested into it, and so by
Hmm.
using it, they kind of like already know the platform, already know what works, already know, like, so it's maybe also a thing of not being scared of maybe using what you already use and do to figure out how to use it better, because maybe companies, I don't know if you guys at Sportico have a whole TikTok department or something, or but I can guarantee that there's many companies out there in sports media that they don't really know and they don't really use it. So if you come in,
Hmm.
with that leverage of having something different, having something new, that makes you attractive as a profile, as someone that could be interesting to bring in. And so, particularly, maybe for you guys at Sportico, what do you think makes Sportico like a great place to work? What is it about Sportico that maybe you didn't have at Sports Illustrated or at the NFL or the Boston Globe or Washington Post? Like, what is it about Sportico that you really like?
Yeah, there's a lot of things. I think the biggest sell for me when I was deciding to join about 2 years ago, was it was gonna obviously new. I joined when it launched, which was very exciting, and it's small. I don't know what the number is now, 10, 12, 13 writers, something like that. Obviously, less than one tenth the size of Sports Illustrated or the Globe or Washington Post, whatever. Um, and so that was really exciting to be part of a small team. It's very collaborative. There's a ton of teamwork. As you know, like the sports world is not that big. So if I don't know somebody, there's a good chance someone on our staff has talked to them before or knows somebody who knows them. And everyone's been very kind about sharing, ideas, contacts, all of that. The teamwork aspect has been phenomenal. So that's kind of internally. I think externally it goes along the same lines of being new. We do have the opportunity to do things differently. I think business in general, sports business, maybe particularly, it's been covered successfully in specific ways over time, and we have a chance to say, okay, how could we do things a little bit differently? We launched with a podcast. As I mentioned, we're online only. We're constantly exploring videos, other multimedia. We've been doing recently over the last year or so. Emily and Eben have been doing these Twitter Spaces on a roughly weekly basis, where we get on Twitter, have a live conversation with each other, bring up people, kind of live Q&A, do all that, and that's kind of stuff you just weren't able to do even 18 months ago, much less 18 years ago. So we're constantly open to those kinds of new technologies, like what we're talking about. Newsletters is a core part of our strategy too. Um, and so being constantly open to new opportunities and not feeling like we have this set way of doing things that we need to maintain gives us the flexibility to try these things. And a lot of them haven't worked. Plenty of them haven't worked, I'm sure. Plenty of them won't work in the future. But the opportunity to try them will allow us to find those things that ultimately do work.
Yeah, but it sounds like, as you're saying, being small kind of like gives you the project freedom, if that makes sense,
Hmm.
to do and try and figure out if something exciting can potentially work. Is there something exciting that you are currently working on, something that you are developing, or something specific that you maybe want to share with us, that is something cool, that is maybe different, that again, I think it's funny to contrast your experiences with what you've seen so far, particularly maybe with Sports Illustrated, the NFL, and those that are big brands, that are more traditional media, that are more established, and that rely less on like creativity just for the sake of it, but that now in Sportico maybe you do have the opportunity to have that creative openness and do something. Is there something creative that you're coming up with right now, or something that you're trying that you're excited about?
Yeah, I don't want to tease too much. I don't know what will come to fruition, but we've been developing or talking about this podcast idea that I have that I would love to do. So hopefully that will happen maybe this year or next. Um, we've been doing a lot with surveys and kind of that kind of stuff, and I think there's more to be done there without saying too much that I'm excited about. Um, but yeah, I mean, just in general, like just even on a day to day basis, it's like an interesting way of approaching a story differently. But, we have the opportunity to do that. We do a fantastic job with our evaluations. How much is each team worth? And we've kind of rebuilt that from the ground up of what are these pages going to look like? How's the information going to be most valuable to people? How do we make that valuable over time and kind of continuing to surface that kind of insight? So those are a few examples that come to mind, but it really is just like a day to day, week to week basis of constantly talking about new ideas because it is all new and trying to now that we are 2 years old, I think it's trying to maintain that energy and that philosophy of keeping to trying to do things because you can settle in. And so I've been really happy that the staff is always constantly still thinking about ways to improve things or to change things entirely.
What's something that you would change in sports media or sports journalism?
Something I would change if I could.
Yeah.
Yeah. Um, I don't know even what this would look like. I'd love people to read more. That's kind of going back to what we were saying. Like writing is my skill. It's what I've kind of spent the most time working on. And people don't read as much as they used to. I think every day, every year, people will read less than they did the day or year before. We might guess. And so I also do on the side this thing called the Sunday Long Read. It's another email newsletter
Yeah,
that
I've
we
seen
send
it.
every Sunday, just
It's
highlighting the best.
long.
It's
It's
quite
actually
long.
really long.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. It takes a whole week to put together, and it takes a whole week to read. So that works out. But putting together, just highlighting the best journalism of the week, stuff that we feel gets overlooked in this kind of churn of taking stuff out of context or the controversy of the day. I don't think we even personally take enough time to sit down, whether it's at the beginning of the day, at the end of the day, and just 20 minutes, 30 minutes, really just actually reading. And I think you get a lot of smarter. So one of the reasons I do that newsletter is just because it forces me Friday 5 o'clock. I take an hour, 2 hours to go through all those things that I bookmarked and said I was going to get to. Now I actually have to do it to decide what goes in the newsletter. So if I could pass that on, because I do think it's valuable both for the reader. Obviously, it's valuable for us as the writers, but even for the readers, I think it's valuable. It's healthy. So that's one trend I would love to see reversed one day. Whether it will happen or not, I don't know. But I still have some hope for that.
And why do you think that happens? Like, why do you think people start reading less? Is it like attention spans, or what today media is like? Because I'm a firm believer that, for instance, people have developed like this like quality filter where immediately if it doesn't like hook them up, but they they don't feel like it's bait,
Hmm.
then they might engage. But if they do have like some small sense that it's bait, then they're
Hmm.
gonna run away. So do you like what do you think? Why do you think people are reading less?
Yeah, it's just the tools and the platforms that are out there aren't really geared, I think, towards making people read or promoting reading. Google used to have this thing called Google Reader. Everyone bemoans, but they killed that off, and then YouTube is so much bigger. TikTok is so much bigger. Facebook has tried at times to kind of promote written material, but what they found is that videos are stickier and get people to hang around longer and watch more ads and all that. And so there's a business part of it too. But yeah, I think it's also just you have to be in this day and age. You have to be I'm blanking on the word, but committed to the concept of sitting down and reading. It doesn't just happen. You need to say, okay, I'm going to carve out this time. I'm going to turn off the distractions, and that's hard to do. We all have a lot of distractions. There's all a lot of things, whether it's
Yeah.
entertainment or work, that's kind of yelling at us all the time. I'm sitting there reading, and I'm getting all these notifications about this sports news or this text message or whatever. It's hard to turn those things off. But I do think if you are able to develop that habit, it gets easier over time.
Yeah, we live in the age of massive abundance and massive information, but at the same
Hmm.
time, that overwhelms the
Right.
users. So it's kind of like exciting, but at the same time scary. So it's about finding. I think it's about finding a balance between what you actually consume. I'm
Hmm.
big on like having a content diet and
Hmm.
choosing very very closely what you read and what you consume.
Hmm.
So I'm big on like platforms like Sportico and the ones that are even I'm big also on like content creators independently. Like of
Hmm.
course myself, maybe I am biased, but I'm big on people following people. Because
Hmm.
sometimes brands uh, cover themselves up with some agenda and some interest of just being profitable, which is fine. At the end of the day,
Hmm.
it's a business, but then there's value in the people that are willing to share content that is high quality to educate and help others understand things more clearly. And I do think that you've been doing that, and that's why I'm a big fan of your work, and that's why I wanted to bring you on. Jacob, this has been so fun, man. It went so fast. 30 minutes. We've been speaking very very fast, but I can't leave without asking you maybe a more personal question. And the one I have for you is who's someone character from history, which you're a big fan on. Who's a character on history that you'd love to like maybe spend or have dinner with just one night? All the conversation that you could have on one night. One character from history. Who would you pick and
Oh boy,
why?
I'm gonna think about this all night because I'm sure my answer in the short term, on the spot, won't be as good as what I can come up with some time to think about it. Um, I over the pandemic, I got somewhat into art and art history. It's not something I'd ever really thought about much, but before. Um, so I would love to go back to some of the salons in Paris in like the 20s and sit down with some of those, whether it's Picasso or whomever, but those writers and artists 100 years ago, to pick their brains a little bit, because just the ability to be as inventive and as creative and to constantly be pushing the bar and pushing the barriers, the way they did for a couple decades there was um, you know pretty crazy. So that's the first one that comes to mind. But yeah, it'd be tough. I think I would sit there in front of that hypothetical time machine like for the rest of my life and like, oh, I don't know, I only get one shot at this. I could go here. Brett Favre was my favorite athlete growing up. I would love to go back, and watch him play in the Super Bowl. Or, I go on and on and probably be stuck there in indecision. So that's probably the answers. Yeah, I'd end up right here stuck thinking about where I'd want to go.
Thank you very much for tuning in. If you enjoyed this episode, hit the subscribe button and leave a review on Apple Podcasts. If you enjoy learning about the business and technology behind sports, make sure you subscribe to the Sports Tech Biz newsletter. I'll leave the link in the show notes. See you all next week. Bye bye.